Welcome to our next 3-minute Gestalt, Unit 27, Historical Influences. So, Gestalt was one of the early psychotherapies, Rogerian therapy. Carl Rogers, he developed that in the 1940s, and Fritz Perls and Laura Perls developed Gestalt originally in the 1940s, and in the 1950s it became popularized in the 1960s. So by the 1960s, there were a number of humanistic psychotherapies, Virginia Satir, and there was psychodrama and a whole lot of burgeoning body therapies, Alexander Lowen, and there was Alexander, he'd been around for a while, but Feldenkrais. So a lot of different therapy forms were evolving at that point. Gestalt, being one of the fundamental ones, has quite a long history. So we have the pillar of Gestalt, which is awareness, which is essentially grounded in phenomenology. So that draws on the philosophies of phenomenology and some of the kind of practices, for instance, Husserl, who developed the phenomenological reduction, as he called it. That's still a method that's kind of practiced in Gestalt in many ways. And then we have the ways that evolved through the 20th century, Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, and the existential thinkers all drew on that phenomenological tradition, and Fritz Perls and his wife Laura were influenced by these ideas. They attended lectures and studied with these people. So that was one sort of track. Another track related was the Gestalt therapists and obviously Gestalt psychologists, and obviously Gestalt therapy derives in some way from that work, although it was mainly theoretical and research based, and it was people like Fritz Perls and Kurt Lewin who applied it in the real world. But that's a whole nother stream which underpins the development of Gestalt. And the Gestalt psychologists were going to the same lectures as Freud was going to. They were contemporaries in many ways of Freud. And so Gestalt psychology was being developed as a theoretical discipline, as a research discipline at the same time as psychoanalysis. And Fritz Perls and Laura Perls, who learned psychoanalysis, also were involved with, for instance, Kurt Goldstein. Fritz Perls was Goldstein's research assistant, one of them. So they influenced the development of Gestalt. And then in the 1920s, German Expressionism, some of the art movements of Germany at the time, these were influencing Fritz and Laura, and had an impact. For instance, Salomo Friedlander and his ideas about the grotesque were part of the development of Gestalt, the grotesque being the ugly elements of human existence, which instead of being shied away from, he was kind of celebrating and fascinated by and wanted to step into. So that's come through in Gestalt, for instance, in polarity work, and what Salomo Friedlander called differential thinking, which Fritz Perls applied, and for instance, in terms of polarities. Another influence on Gestalt is, what was around in the 1960s. So, say, for instance, Marino and psychodrama, although Fritz didn't give a lot of credence to him, nevertheless, he drew from his ideas, and Gestalt and its experiment definitely has these psychodramatic roots. But the various body therapies, so for instance, Fritz worked with, did analysis with Wilhelm Reich, and that obviously influenced him because Reich was interested in the body. He was interested in face-to-face therapy rather than behind the couch. He was interested in interactive therapy, experiential therapy. He was one of the first to develop these kind of ideas, and obviously Fritz drew from that and integrated that into Gestalt. Then Gestalt has also an interest in society to some degree. There was a group of people, Fritz Perls and Paul Weitz and Paul Heffeline and Paul Goodman and Richard Heffeline, all came together and were developing the ideas of Gestalt. So people like Paul Goodman contributed sort of social anarchy and some libertarian type of ideas. Fritz was influenced by people like Kropotkin, who was a Russian anarchist. So that's a kind of ingredient in the development of Gestalt. And the existentialists and existentialism and Sartre's ideas These also heavily influence Gestalt. Gestalt is certainly an existential type of therapy, interested in the what is, doesn't take some of the nihilism from existentialism, but really emphasizes more on the elements of choice. Field theory, yes, came from Jan Smuts and from Kurt Lewin and from an orientation around holism, which Fritz and the group developed. And then dialogue especially came out of the work of Martin Buber, particularly, and Laura Pearls, I think, was influenced and knew Buber and brought his ideas into Gestalt. So Gestalt has this wonderfully rich historical, philosophical traditions which it draws on from the West and then from the East, Zen Buddhism and use of awareness, which is very much integral in Gestalt, and Taoism. And I think Gestalt is very much a Taoist type of psychotherapy and is drawn also from the sort of roots of being with what is and the organismic self-regulation, the natural flow of things. So this is a very brief synopsis, a snapshot of some of the historical influences on Gestalt.